The rain had returned to Althorpe that morning, soft, insistent, and strangely tender, as if the sky itself mourned her still. Prince William stood by the oval lake, the cold wind pulling at his coat, his breath steady but shallow, as though each exhale risked breaking the silence that had guarded this place for decades. He had come alone, long after the formal tributes had ended, to visit the island where his mother rested. This was not duty. It was something older, heavier. When his gloved hand brushed aside the damp petals of the lilies, something resisted. A small, folded letter, sealed in faded wax. His pulse slowed. The handwriting, curved, graceful, bore the unmistakable touch of her hand. He had not seen that script since the summer of her final days. The world around him blurred into soundless rain as he stared down at the past, risen from beneath her flowers. The rain had quieted to a fine mist by the time William moved from the grave's edge. He found himself staring at the letter, as though afraid it might vanish if he blinked. The seal was still intact, faintly marked with the crest his mother once used on personal correspondence, a symbol of warmth, not of crown. His heart thudded with a rhythm too old to name. This was no mere coincidence. Someone had placed it here for him to find, years after her passing, hidden beneath the flowers that marked her resting place. His thoughts flickered to the last time he saw her. The laughter, the hurried goodbye, the unanswered call. For a moment he could almost hear her voice again, not as the world remembered her, but as he did. Soft, alive, calling him, "Darling boy." He pressed the letter to his lips, tasting the rain and memory all at once. He stepped toward the wooden bench overlooking the water, the same bench where he once sat as a boy beside her, his head on her shoulder, her hand brushing his hair. He sat there now, a grown man carrying the same ache, the same unanswered questions. The letter felt heavier with every second. His gloved thumb traced its edges, and he noticed faint water stains, not from the rain, but older, as though it had been touched by tears long before this morning. The stillness of the lake pressed against him. This was not an accident. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew exactly what this letter meant. His heart whispered the impossible. Could it be from her? Written before the crash, left for him to find when the time was right. As the clouds thinned and light began to break through, William turned the letter over once more, studying the handwriting across the back. The curves, the flourishes, they were not forged. He would have known her penmanship anywhere. He remembered watching her write at the piano table, her face half hidden behind a curtain of light. The faint scent of her perfume filling the air. "Always write from the heart," she once told him. His hands shook as he traced those same letters, as if by touching them he could bridge the years between them. But the thought gnawed at him. Who placed it there? Who kept this secret? He could feel the storm rising again, not in the sky, but in his chest. He knew what he had to do. The letter would not stay sealed forever, not in his trembling hands. The moment demanded courage. Not the kind learned from duty or service, but the quiet kind his mother had shown in every soft rebellion of love. He inhaled deeply, his breath catching as he lifted the letter toward his chest once more. The lake seemed to still, the air around him thick with waiting. And then, with the gentlest pressure, he cracked the red wax. It broke with a soft sound, small, final. Inside, the paper unfolded like a whisper. The handwriting bloomed before him. Fluid, graceful, utterly familiar. And at the top, in her delicate script, the words that would undo him. "For my son, when he is ready to forgive the past." The silence that followed the breaking of the seal felt almost sacred. William stood perfectly still, the parchment trembling between his fingers. The ink, though faded, carried the unmistakable grace of her hand. The long curves, the deliberate softness of every letter. At the top, her familiar crest pressed faintly in gold, one that had not been seen since her passing. His breath shuddered. This was not a forgery. It couldn't be. Every line felt alive. Intimate, warm, written by someone who had known the rhythm of his childhood heart. His eyes scanned the first words again. My dearest William, if you are reading this, it means that time has done what love alone could not. It has brought you back to me. He pressed his lips together, the air thick in his lungs. The moment felt impossible, yet utterly real. He read further, his voice catching on each syllable. If I cannot guide your steps, may these words remind you who you are. You were never meant to be only a symbol, William. You were born to be human first, and to love without apology. The handwriting wavered near the bottom, as though her hand had trembled while writing. William's chest tightened. It was not just her voice he heard. It was her truth, unfiltered, written for a future she would never see. His hands curled around the edges of the paper. For all the years he'd spent trying to balance duty and heart, this letter felt like permission to breathe again. Somewhere above the lake, a single ray of sunlight cut through the mist, landing directly on the grave. Gentle, uninvited, and divine. The second page slipped from the fold, its edges damp but intact. One day, my darling boy, it read, you will face choices that test what you value most. Choose kindness, even when it costs you comfort. And when the world demands perfection, remember that love is the only crown that cannot be taken from you. His throat closed around the words. She had written them not to guide a prince, but to anchor a son. He thought of his children, of how he would someday explain the woman the world called its princess, and how little they could ever know of her laughter, her defiance, her tenderness. He wanted them to feel her presence, to know that the woman who once broke the rules for love had left behind something greater than tragedy. She'd left her voice. He turned the final page, and his breath caught. The words were addressed not to him, but to both of them. William, Harry, my loves. If life separates you, promise me you will find your way back to one another. Brothers are not born for duty, but for each other. The ink at the bottom had blurred, perhaps by water, perhaps by tears. He could almost hear her voice, soft and resolute, the way she had spoken to them after their quarrels as children. His throat ached. He imagined her writing this in a quiet moment, somewhere safe, somewhere private, never knowing these words would one day outlive her. He closed his eyes, clutching the pages to his chest, as though afraid to let her go again. He stayed there until the wind softened and the day began to fade. The letter rested safely in his pocket now, its weight close to his heart. He knew it would change nothing. The world would still expect him to smile, to bow, to lead. But something within him had shifted. The boy who once reached for her hand in crowds still lived inside him, no longer silenced by years of duty. Her words had crossed time itself, reminding him that love was not weakness, and grief was not shame. As he turned to leave, a gentle ripple crossed the lake, faint, graceful, like a whisper of farewell. And for the first time in many years, Prince William smiled, not for the cameras, not for the crown, but for her. The following morning, London wore its usual disguise, polished calm, polite distance. But William carried a storm beneath his coat. The letter had not left his pocket since Althorpe. Every time he touched it, his pulse quickened, not from disbelief, but from the weight of what it meant. He knew he couldn't keep it from Harry. For years they'd walked parallel paths, divided by duty and silence, pretending the space between them wasn't widening. Now the words written for both of them burned like truth in his hand. He sat by the window of Kensington Palace, the city stretching below him, gray and endless. His reflection stared back. Not a prince, not a future king, just a son who had found a message too sacred to hide. And somewhere deep inside he feared that sharing it might reopen wounds neither of them had learned to heal. That afternoon, Harry arrived, unannounced, unexpected. The air between them carried the kind of stillness that follows a long absence. They didn't embrace right away. They hadn't in years. William stood near the fireplace, the letter already laid on the table beside him. Harry's eyes darted toward it. Curious, wary. There was something fragile about this moment, something that could either mend or shatter. "What's this?" Harry finally asked, his voice low but sharp around the edges. William hesitated, then whispered, "It's from her." The silence that followed was unbearable. Harry's brow furrowed, disbelief flickering into something darker, grief disguised as anger. William didn't move. He only nodded once, quietly. "It was under her flowers," he said. "She wrote to us." Harry reached for the letter slowly, his fingers hesitating before touching the fragile paper. When he began to read, his breath faltered. "My darlings, if life separates you, promise me you'll find your way back to one another." The words struck like a blade. His jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. "You found this now?" he whispered. William nodded, his voice almost breaking. "Yesterday." The clock ticked in the silence between them. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was the grief they'd both buried, now clawing its way back into the light. Harry set the paper down gently, his hands trembling. For a brief moment, they were no longer princes divided by oceans and choices, just two sons hearing their mother's voice again, and realizing she had never truly left. The hours passed in slow, heavy silence. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been in years. "She wanted us to forgive each other," he said. William nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "She always did." The letter lay between them like a fragile bridge. Neither knew how to cross it, how to undo the years of distance, the words left unsaid. The choices misunderstood. For a long while, they said nothing more. Only the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the air. The same rain that had fallen over Althorpe the day before. And somehow, through the quiet, they both understood that their mother's voice had reached them exactly when it was meant to. Not to haunt, but to heal. When Harry finally rose to leave, he didn't look back at first. But before reaching the door, he paused. "She always knew," he murmured, his hand resting briefly on the frame. William's voice was low, almost breaking. "She did." Their eyes met, not as brothers divided by duty, but as sons bound by memory. For a fleeting second, it felt as though they were boys again, standing beside her, hearing her laughter echo through the corridors. Harry nodded once, then left quietly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the rain. William turned back toward the letter on the table. He smoothed its creases gently, folded it once more, and whispered, "Thank you, Mum." The fire crackled softly in reply, like a mother's hand smoothing her son's hair. Sleep refused him that night. The letter lay on his desk beneath the lamp, its pages illuminated like something half-holy. William turned it over and over, noticing for the first time a faint impression on the final page. The ghost of another's handwriting pressed into the fibers. Someone else had touched it, someone who had handled it after her death. His pulse quickened. He retrieved a magnifying glass and traced the faded mark. It wasn't hers. A single name appeared at the corner. Mary C. He knew that name. Mary Clark. One of Diana's longtime attendants at Kensington, gone from the public eye shortly after the funeral. The realization hit him like thunder in the quiet. She had kept this all these years, and for reasons he could only begin to imagine. She had chosen now to return it. Morning found him behind the wheel of a dark sedan, driving north through the rolling fog. Althorpe faded in the rearview mirror. London vanished into grey. Somewhere beyond the quiet lanes of Norfolk he knew Mary Clark still lived. The woman who had once buttoned his mother's coats, whispered comfort in palace corridors, and disappeared when grief turned the world into cameras. The road curved through fields painted in muted autumn colors, the hum of the tires steady beneath him. Every mile carried him closer, not just to a truth, but to the part of his past that had never healed. His mother's words still echoed in his mind. When you feel lost, go where kindness last lived. The cottage appeared small, almost hidden behind an overgrown hedge. When Mary Clark opened the door, the years fell away like dust from a memory. Her hair was silver now, her eyes still kind. The same eyes that once watched two young princes run through palace gardens. "I wondered when you'd come," she said softly, as though she had been expecting him all along. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. William held out the letter. "You placed it there," he said, not accusing, but aching for truth. She nodded, her gaze steady. "She wrote it the week before Paris," she whispered. "She told me to hide it where only love would one day find it." They sat together at the kitchen table as rain began to fall again. That same English rain that seemed to follow every truth in his life. Mary unfolded her story carefully, like the letter itself. Diana had written 2 copies, one for the boys, one sealed for safekeeping, fearing her words might never reach them otherwise. She said, "Love doesn't vanish, it only waits," Mary murmured. For years, she had kept the letter hidden among her own things, waiting for the right moment. "Why now?" William asked. Mary's eyes softened. "Because you were ready," she said. Her words struck deeper than he could bear. Ready, not to read, but to forgive. As the rain eased, William stood by the doorway, preparing to leave. Mary placed a small photograph in his hand, Diana at the piano, smiling, unaware the camera had found her. "She wanted you to have this," Mary said. It was tucked inside her journal, next to the words, "For when they are grown." William stared at the image, his throat tightening. His mother's eyes seemed alive again, full of that impossible blend of strength and tenderness. He slipped the photograph beside the letter inside his coat. As he stepped outside, the sky broke open, light flooding the path ahead. He turned back once, meeting Mary's gaze. She nodded. No words, just the quiet assurance of a promise fulfilled. The drive back to London felt quieter than it should have. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, mirroring the weight inside his chest. William kept the letter and the photograph on the seat beside him, glancing at them every few miles as though afraid they might disappear. He replayed Mary's words again and again, "Because you were ready." It was strange how forgiveness could arrive, not as a feeling, but as an understanding. He wasn't sure whether he was ready to forgive the world or himself, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep this truth locked inside any longer. His mother's voice had bridged time, reaching beyond loss, beyond resentment, to remind them who they were meant to be. It was time to call his brother. When Harry answered the phone, his voice was cautious, tired. They hadn't spoken since that afternoon at Kensington. "I found out who left it," William said simply. There was a long pause. Then a quiet, "Who?" "Mary Clark," he replied. "She kept it all these years." Another silence. Then Harry's sigh. Low, uncertain, but not angry. "She loved Mum," he said. There was a stillness that felt like a door cracking open, small but real. Harry, William continued, his voice softer now. "She wanted us to find our way back. Maybe this is how." The line stayed quiet, filled with memories that needed no words. Then, almost hesitantly, Harry said, "Let's start there." Days later, they met again. Not in a palace, not for duty, but in the gardens of Kensington, where the flowers bloomed year-round in her memory. It was late afternoon, the light soft and forgiving. William held the letter. Harry carried nothing but his hands in his pockets. They didn't talk much at first. They just walked, two men tracing the same paths they had once raced through as boys. When they finally stopped by her statue, the silence broke. "You kept her promise," Harry said quietly. William shook his head. "She did." A faint smile crossed Harry's face. Fragile, but true. The distance between them didn't vanish that day, but something inside it shifted. Something finally beginning to heal. They sat together on a stone bench, overlooking the garden pond. William unfolded the letter once more, the paper worn but unbroken. They read it again, not aloud, but together, their eyes following the same lines in silence. When they reached her final words, "Brothers are not born for duty, but for each other." Harry closed his eyes, his breath trembling. William reached over, his hand resting briefly on his brother's shoulder. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. Grief had separated them once. Love, their mother's greatest rebellion, was drawing them back. For the first time in years, the space between them felt like a bridge instead of a wound. When evening came, the gardens were nearly empty. The brothers stood one last time before the statue, the figure of their mother smiling, frozen in bronze but alive in their memory. William looked at her face, the familiar curve of her smile, the kindness that had outlasted time. "She'd like this," Harry said. "She would," William replied. They turned to leave together, their steps slow, unhurried. Behind them, the last light of sunset spilled over the garden, catching the bronze just so. And for one impossible instant, it looked as though she were bathed in living light again. Somewhere in the quiet, a mother's promise had finally been kept. Night draped itself over London like a quiet benediction. The palace grounds had long gone still, but William remained awake, standing by the window of his private study. The city lights shimmered below, beautiful, distant, untouchable. In his hands, the letter rested once more, fragile but whole. He had read it a dozen times now, yet each word seemed to shift depending on how he felt. One night forgiveness, another remembrance, another hope. He thought of his children asleep upstairs, their laughter, their innocence. He wondered if they would ever truly know who their grandmother had been, or how her love had reshaped the meaning of legacy. The crown would one day be his to bear, but tonight he understood that what she left behind was not duty, but a reminder. To lead without love is to forget what it means to be human. He walked softly through the corridor, the hush of night pressing against the walls. The nursery door was ajar. Inside, his children slept curled beneath blankets, faces peaceful, untouched by the noise of the world waiting for them outside. He knelt beside them, brushing a stray strand of hair from his daughter's forehead. His heart swelled with the same ache his mother must have known. That fierce, impossible wish to shield them from everything. He whispered into the stillness, "She would have loved you." The words trembled into the quiet air, half prayer, half promise. For the first time in years, the thought of her no longer brought pain alone. It brought warmth, the kind that lingers long after the storm has passed. Later, he sat at his desk again, the house silent around him. The letter lay beside a new sheet of paper. Slowly, he began to write. Not as a prince, not as a public figure, but as a father. "When you are old enough to understand," he wrote, "I want you to know the kind of love that built this family. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and it is yours to carry." His pen moved steadily, his mother's words echoing in the rhythm of his own. He wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was continuing it, adding his voice to the story she had started. The page filled with quiet truth, the kind that doesn't belong in speeches or headlines, but in hearts. At dawn, the first light crept across the gardens. William stepped outside, the cold air fresh against his skin. He walked to the small stone bench beneath the willow tree, the same bench he and Harry had sat upon days earlier. He unfolded the photograph once more, gazing at her smile. The world had taken so much from her, yet here she was, still shaping it through him. He whispered, "I'll tell them everything, Mum." The wind stirred softly through the leaves, a sound almost like an answer. He closed his eyes, letting the moment settle into his bones. The peace, the promise, the unbroken line between what was lost and what endures. By the time the sun had fully risen, the letter was sealed again, not in secrecy, but in safekeeping. He placed it inside a small cedar box alongside his new note and locked it within his desk drawer. One day he would give it to his children, just as she had given it to him, not through chance, but through love that waited patiently for the right moment. Standing by the window once more, he watched the sky brighten over the city. For the first time in a long while, he felt light. His mother's legacy was not written in marble or royal archives. It lived in the quiet choices her sons made after her. And in that stillness, William smiled softly, knowing that love, once planted, never dies. The seasons had begun to turn again by the time William returned to Althorpe. The air carried the faint scent of autumn. Wood smoke, wet earth, and something gentle he could never quite name. The drive through the long avenue of lime trees felt familiar, sacred, as if each branch bowed in silent welcome. The island lay still, mirrored perfectly in the water, the flowers freshly laid upon the grave. He carried nothing this time. No letter, no questions, only quiet gratitude. The world beyond the gates still demanded its crowns, its rituals, its endless noise. But here there was only her voice, soft and eternal, woven through the rustle of the trees. He stepped onto the bridge, his reflection rippling in the lake below, and whispered, "We're all right now, Mum." He walked the narrow path to her resting place, each step slow, deliberate. The wind carried whispers through the willow leaves above him, their movement like soft applause. He knelt, brushing aside a few fallen petals, the gesture no longer weighed by sorrow but shaped by love. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for teaching me that hearts don't serve crowns. Crowns serve hearts." He smiled faintly at the thought. The rain had not yet begun, but the sky seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single white rose, placing it among the others. This time, there were no tears, only stillness, the peace that follows when everything unspoken has finally been understood. As he rose to leave, a sound caught him. Faint laughter, carried by wind. It wasn't real, and yet it was everything he remembered. Bright, unguarded, alive. For a moment he could almost see her. Not the icon frozen in photographs, but the woman who chased them barefoot through palace gardens, who whispered courage into their fear. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the empty space between heartbeats. Some ghosts never haunt, they guide. And in that fleeting instant he understood. She hadn't left messages to be discovered. She'd left lessons to be lived. The echo of her voice wasn't behind him anymore. It was within him. Back across the bridge he paused one last time. From this angle, the grave appeared smaller, almost hidden, like a secret kept safe by the land itself. The world would never know this moment. There would be no photographs, no headlines, no ceremony, and that was how it should be. Love, he realized, was meant to live in quiet places, not marble ones. As he reached the path leading back to the car, he turned once more toward the island. The sunlight touched the lake in gold and silver streaks, and in that reflection he thought he saw her again. Not waving goodbye, but watching, proud. As his car disappeared down the long avenue, the wind lifted through the trees, scattering the petals across the water. The lake shimmered, catching the sun in 1,000 tiny sparks. Somewhere the world continued. Loud, restless, unyielding. But here in this quiet corner of England, love had done the unthinkable. It had survived every silence, every distance, every year. William would return again someday, not because of duty, but because the heart always returns to where it was first understood. And though no one would hear it, if one listened closely, the air around Althorpe still carried her voice. Calm, luminous, eternal, whispering, "You've done well, my darling boy."